Okay, if you could please make your way back to your seats. We're ready for our next presentation. And this is from Ms. Carlee McLeod, the president of the Utility Shareholders of North Dakota.
I hear some applause. There are some fellow lobbyists in the crowd, so we like to support each other. Thank you for having me. My name's Carlee McLeod, as you heard. I appreciate especially the segue from the conversation about choosing your own adventure between litigation and legislation. I have to tell you, when you choose that adventure, I also live in a world where anecdotes about hairless dogs defecating contractors and naked landowners are not unusual. So consider that and choose carefully. So you all have been hearing about very substantive, practical things during this conference that have to do with your daily practice. I'm going to give you a different sort of overview about energy policy in North Dakota in general. I'm going to talk about the legislative process since our boom has begun, and I'm going to bring you through the legislation currently on the books, or currently being suggested, talk a little bit about our comprehensive state energy policy, which has been on the books since 2011. And then I'm going to talk where I think this might be going as far as energy policy in the future of North Dakota. And I hope you find something interesting about it. I will tell you that as someone who lobbies for the energy industry, we need the people who are out in the fields doing the actual work and in fields, courts, law offices, etc., to help us to better craft the policy. So it's very important that you hear where we're going, and that if you ever feel that you want to be part of this process, get in touch with whichever association represents your group and lend your voice, because otherwise we get laws on the books that are not practical, that don't reflect your practice, and you do end up in court more. Okay, so jumping into the presentation. Energy legislation is very broad, and in part it's broad because the energy industry is broad. So I just wanted to do a quick briefer of what this includes in North Dakota. As far as energy generation in North Dakota, it's comprised of coal, natural gas, renewables, and hydro, largely dominated by coal. I checked with Mr. Coal, who just walked in, David Straley, earlier. The numbers on the books are from 2010, and at that time, 82% of our energy generated in the state came from coal. Mr. Straley said now it's probably 75 to 80. We see a little bit more of what he calls expensive natural gas coming into the market, and some of the other renewables and wind power taking up some of that slack. But that is where we're getting our generation. Of course, you're all here because you work in the oil and gas industry, and I don't have petroleum in my generation here. And so we do know we have other resources in the state than what we're using to create our power. Those include petroleum, natural gas, lignite, wind, geothermal, hydroelectric, recovered energy, solar, synthetical, natural gas, ethanol, and a variety of biomasses and fuels. So we have a very rich state with a lot of resources, and this creates a pretty broad group of issues facing the energy industry right now. So I've broken down some of those issues, and I'm going to talk about how they come together to create our energy policy. Those energy issues listed here are production, of course, the mining, the harvesting, the capturing, whatever the resource it might be. Transportation, and by that I mean moving that product to market wherever it is. Generation, creating the electricity from that product. Transmission and distributing, that's getting it to the customer. Environmental concerns, which I think you've heard throughout this conference. And then regulation that ties in any of those, zoning, health, rates of electricity, etc. And that's already a pretty broad list, but if you're actually thinking about what it takes to keep our energy industry, wow, I can't talk today, or I'm going to pull a Rubio, and I have to say that joke kills up at the Capitol, so. All right, thank you. But when you're thinking about the issues that actually keep this industry running, it's even broader than that. And so it keeps all of us involved in the energy legislation industry pretty busy. This includes taxation and the business climate, the overall business climate. Workforce. I know that these aren't new themes to you, but under workforce, we have to consider housing, education, childcare, community support, healthcare, retail, social and recreational issues. So you can imagine we're running around trying to keep all of these issues together and trying to help North Dakota have the best framework to continue the industry we have, to move forward with an even better industry, and hopefully achieve those goals of energy independence. So let me back up and talk about legislation since our new boom started. And I'm going to go real high level here because I could speak for days and days about specific bills, and trust me, none of you want to hear me that long. So I'll just go back to the early 2000s. In the early 2000s, we didn't have the oil development we have now. Coal was really at the front of our energy development. I believe we have about 800 years of coal reserves, maybe 900 depending on who you talk to. And so we were really focused on that sort of industry and developing that. There were occasional tweaks to the laws regarding reclamation, tax policies, and the ever-present idea of trying to thwart any sort of federal control or involvement in our process. And around the mid-2000s, we knew about the Bakken. It was a concept. We had no idea how big this issue would get. And so we were really focused on biofuels. The technology for that had come to the forefront, and our energy legislation really sought to support that development. In 2007, pardon the pun, but the Bakken started rocking, and that is when we started seeing our framework really get put into code and develop. Legislators put a lot of time, and I shouldn't say legislators. When I'm talking energy policy, it's our governor's office, it's all of the state agencies that are involved in it, it's the legislators, and it's all of the industry coming together. But I'm talking specifically about legislation in this time frame, so this is when our legislators started setting that framework for all of those people to come together and move our policy forward to help our industry. We were still focused heavily on renewables, even though we knew that this oil was coming and we have massive amounts of lignite. Our legislature was really supportive of this new endeavor into all of the renewable types of energy, wind, solar, biofuels. And in fact, at that time, they codified the North Dakota support of an initiative, the 25 by 25 initiative, which I'm sure you've all heard about, but it is that we will have 25% of our energy coming from some sort of renewable by the year 2025. So that was codified, and we started laying the groundwork to meet those goals. Now, in doing that, the legislature set up a commission to do some work, to get all these ideas on the table, to do some research, industry-based research, and figure out what was feasible, what the best possible way is to go forward. That is now called the Empower ND Commission, and I'm going to talk more about it after I go through the legislative history, but I think that that group is going to be helping us move forward to pretty sound energy policy in the state. At the same time, the legislators understood that we have a pipeline issue. We cannot use all the petroleum that we have here in the state. We need to get it to market. And so they set up something called the Pipeline Authority. Some of you may work with them. That is a group that seeks to help link industry with marketplace through the pipeline companies, helping them figure out where their price break might be, and helping them go through some of the regulatory issues involved in bringing pipelines into the state. The legislature, on the other hand, they didn't want to just be oil focused. They set up the Renewable Energy Council. And so they were really looking at balancing our future no matter where those resources were. Okay, so that's 2007. Did it advance? I can't quite see it. I think so. So 2009, we felt the effects for a couple of years of the oil boom. And so our shift is really moving towards oil and gas development as far as our legislative initiatives go. Charles yesterday talked about the surface owner issues. I call it the Surface Owner Bill of Rights. That was passed through the legislature. We had a framework for oil and gas in our laws, of course, from earlier booms, but this is a whole new issue, a whole new boom, and conditions are different than the 80s. So this was important for them to get passed to consider some of the issues that were new to this time frame. Natural gas flaring became an issue for one of the first times, again, during this boom. We had the framework, but more bills were introduced. Didn't really make it through the process, but they started thinking about what are we doing with all this gas that's being flared. Environmental policies started coming to the forefront. Carbon sequestration, climate change, offshore drilling, these were all the focus of resolutions that came out of the legislature. Again, resolutions don't have the force and effect of law, but they're often passed for either political reason or some other reason to urge Congress to act. And in these cases, they urged Congress to open up drilling in ANWR and to basically back off as far as carbon and climate change initiatives go. We did expand a little bit of the renewable legislation, and we started looking at the ethanol. So the Ethanol Council was created. But really the focus of this session was local funding issues and infrastructure. The communities involved in oil development were feeling this burden from the quick growth, and legislators were trying to figure out how can we meet that. And so that took the forefront as far as funding, taxation, figuring out how to get the money back to the people in that area. And also the state and tribal compact was codified at this time, encouraging the oil development on tribal lands and creating the break between what part of that development would belong to the tribes and what part of that development could be taxed by the state. So that was 2009. And we thought we were in a pretty good place when we left 2009, and we had some reasonable forecasts, and we thought, okay, we've met these needs. And then all of a sudden, as you know, things have gone crazy since 2009. In 2011, these legislators came in realizing we didn't have the best framework in place. The legislature then adopted its formal comprehensive state energy plan, which I will go through some of the issues in a bit, because they really wanted to have a better framework and a better way to answer some of these issues, and they didn't want to be caught in crisis mode down the line. And so they wanted to encourage the development of the oil, make sure the funding was there, but set this policy in place. But they knew that if the feds came in and said fracking couldn't happen anymore, that everything that they've done would go away. And so one of their attempts to thwart any sort of federal intervention was to pass a law that says fracking is an acceptable thing to do, acceptable technology to use. Again, whether or not that would stand up anywhere, they passed that law to make sure that we knew they supported it. They tried to deal with the increase in pipeline activity. There were multiple bills introduced this time trying to get pipelines to submit their maps to some overall group so that they'd have a large map of pipelines and figure out where everything is, where we need more assistance, and Pipeline Authority kept stepping up and doing more. The landowners did come in and they wanted more protection. I didn't really see a lot of legislation passed that expanded their rights much, but there were a group of landowners in the halls a couple of times. They came, they vented, and then they left. The renewables were relatively quiet at this time. We had put the framework in place for renewables, but we were focusing on oil, so we didn't do a whole lot, except that we did codify a definition of green diesel, and we did allow a tax incentive for that. And then we started looking at the byproducts of energy development. One of the issues that was considered was potash. And if you don't know what potash is, it's a mineral that's often found in the same areas of oil and gas development that's used for fertilizer. And the legislatures put a lot of thought into how we could tax this. They couldn't figure out how to get money back to the communities if production did take off, so they tabled that because they thought that it was probably 5 years down the line, but they figured out how to tax it. They tried to figure out if they could incentivize using recycled water, old fracking water, or if frac sand could be supplemented by whatever it was that they were doing in the ground for potash. But they were really trying to figure out, okay, how does this development for oil and gas that we're experiencing help us with other industries? They didn't come to a lot of solutions, but they started thinking. So that was a good thing. Okay, so that's the history leading up to today. And I'm going to talk about some of the common themes that we see based off that history. First of all, the first issue is that we are all about state supremacy, and we are not about federal involvement. And you see that throughout. In fact, I had a blast actually looking at all this legislative history. I acknowledge I'm a big nerd for that because I pulled, 400 or 500 bills, and I was enthralled the whole time. But I was looking at some of these resolutions, and they are funny. One that failed just had me laughing. It said the EPA could not come onto any state land unless it had explicit permission from a state agency that had jurisdiction over whatever it was that they were testing. And it failed. And they also said that any EPA rule would be invalid unless, again, the state agency overlooking those issues said okay. That just, I don't know, made me chuckle. So this is what we do. We get very protective of our resources, and it doesn't matter if they're logical or we can hold them up in court. They're going to put this out there. And so that made me chuckle. Again, we urge the opening up ANWR, anti-climate-based anti-climate change-based legislation. And by that I mean they're not saying it doesn't exist. What they're saying is if it does exist, let's look for the real science. Let's not enforce some sort of regulation, change the process by which we deal with our resources unless we know that what we're doing is cost effective and actually has some sort of effect to lessen whatever the effect of carbon dioxide would be. Many resolutions were introduced regarding those issues. But I think one of the smarter things we did to try to maintain state supremacy is that we started looking at the regulatory agencies we had, and if there was any place we needed to bulk up what they had to make the feds happy, we did that. So if the health department currently has control over a certain regulation, but we've heard word that the feds might come in and change something unless the states have certain things in place, we started looking at how we could put those things into place, whether it's funding new employees or providing our own regulatory structure. We have started doing that. And again, we started looking at passing legislation saying that the state approves of certain things, finds them acceptable. Currently, we have a coal combustible bill up, which I'll talk about later, but that is in that theme. Okay, so another theme that we're seeing, and you've had experts up here who are far more versed than I, but one of the common themes is surface rights versus mineral rights. Briefly, we've defined those, we've provided for damages if they're breached, and we've also urged the use of mediation to try to ease any concerns between the two parties. We have a couple of mediation bills up again this session trying to expand the use of the mediation program. Okay, so this is one of the issues that takes the forefront, and I have to tell you, it has in the past taken up a lot of my time. This session, there's really nothing going on with taxes, so it doesn't take any of my time. I'm joking, of course, if you read the paper, but taxation is a huge theme for any sort of energy legislation. And it's broader than people think. If you read the papers, the op-ed pages are talking about the oil tax on extraction and production. Well, how we tax extraction and production for oil is one thing, but we have a larger issue with taxes. It's not just the oil and gas. We also tax generation of energy, transmission, distribution. We have our corporate tax rates. Corporations who have oil interests or any other sort of interest are also taxed on their corporate side rather than just their production. And then we look at the royalties and income taxes of those people receiving them. And that's just the rates of the money coming in. But then we have to think about how do we incentivize certain things. And so incentives and exemptions come to the table. And then we have to think about how do we get the money back out so that we know that these communities can withstand this sort of production. And so the tax distributions to political subdivisions has taken a lot of the focus in the past 2 sessions. Right now, it's anybody's guess where that is going to go. I've heard that the bill, and I've stayed away from how they're going to get the money back, will just support them giving money back to the communities. I've heard that the bill has so many triggers and different sorts of separate buckets that it would make your head spin. And I used to be in charge of distributing the old one, so I thought I had that down, but I can't make heads or tails of this one. So anyway, so there's that issue for tax distributions. There's also tax distributions for overall infrastructure needs, not those coming directly back to the political subdivisions as a result of the tax they're paying, but where the state is going to focus their tax money for those infrastructure needs. So whether it's the grant programs that Governor Dalrymple has going on right now, or whether it's the millions of dollars we put into roads, that is all part of this overall tax picture. And then kind of overall, that whole tax picture is where are we as far as developing a policy of how we want to treat these non-renewable resources? A lot of the discussion on the current production and extraction tax suggestions goes on this topic of, hey, we only have so much oil in the ground. We're only going to be able to get this much money off of it for so long as a state. Do we really want to cut the rate? You know, we only have this much to get out of it. But the other side says, if you don't lower the taxes, businesses look at where the best game is in the states. And if our taxes don't support the best game in the state, oil play is going to go somewhere else. And so that sort of policy discussion is really at the front of how they're trying to solve this solution. I might get into that a bit more when we talk about the current legislation, but it's something that plays out in their overall themes of taxation. Another common theme are the regulatory and environmental concerns. Now, we don't have any control over what the feds do, obviously, but we try to do what we can on the state level, but we do have control over a lot of things on the state level. Routing and permitting pipelines and transmission lines, that is part of the state purview. Generation planning, the authority of the PSC, rate recovery, and site determination. These are all things that we have state control over, and we are often going in and trying to tweak the laws to make them, I don't know if I want to say user-friendly or more advantageous to industry, but we tweak them throughout the process depending on where the will of the people is. And then, of course, there are always bills coming up about consumer and environmental protection. Okay, one last common theme is the impact of the growth. And if you notice, there's a lot of overlap from these themes I've been talking about because it's one big system with a lot of different pieces. But the impact of the growth, legislation that comes down to community infrastructure falls under this. So you heard a report from Judge Hagerty yesterday on the court system, the impact of development on the court system. That falls under energy legislation. Schools. We need good schools in the area where we have our workforce coming in, but we also need schools to be able to prepare students to be good workers in the future for the industry. And so that also falls under energy legislation at times. Roads. Roads are vital as far as legislative themes and energy legislation. Housing, social concerns, healthcare and emergency services. Now, healthcare concerns, social concerns, and emergency services, they've been discussed in prior sessions, but the legislature has kind of tried to take a hands-off approach on that. They're willing to give money to schools and roads and tangible things, but they have been very hesitant to spend any sort of money on more social things or things that they can't put their hands on. And I think we're seeing a shift in the tide there. But it all comes down to their policy discussion about whose responsibility is it to pay for these things. Does it belong to the state, or should it fall on industry? Should it fall on the local subdivisions to fund their own? Or we're just not sure. So those are all common themes that pop up. And so when I tell you I had a broad overview of what's going on, it's pretty broad. And so we run from one issue to another trying to figure out how it fits in the overall piece of the puzzle. Now fast forward to this session, and here are a few of the issues. I mentioned before that in 2007, I think it was, our first natural gas bill came up from this boom. Natural gas is a huge issue this session. I don't know how many bills there are, maybe 10 or 12 that came out to be introduced, but they all had a slightly different approach to figuring out how we can capture more natural gas at the well site. I checked with one of the natural gas people yesterday, and she said that we're currently capturing about 72% of gas at the well site. So we've got 28% left to figure out how to capture. And this is a big concern for our legislators and our citizens, both because of the lost profit from letting it just flare and any sort of environmental concerns that come from that. And so the bills this session have tried to figure out how can we do that. A couple of bills just said you will capture it. There's no waiver. You can't just flare it. Of course, that's not economically feasible. And I followed up with the natural gas person yesterday, and I asked her, why aren't you capturing more of this? And she said, our biggest problem right now are the easements that we need from the landowners to be able to get our pipelines in, our gathering lines, to capture the gas at the wellhead. She said everything else we can do, not a problem, but we have so much landowner fatigue in that area that they don't want one more thing. And she gave me a nice little anecdotal story, but it doesn't involve anyone naked, unfortunately. But there's a cafe in one of the communities that her company works in, and the rumor is that there's a board on the wall, and every time a landowner signs a new easement, they go in and they write their price on the board, or they check the board, and if their price is above the highest price paid, they cross off the highest, write theirs in. And so the landowners around there know, hey, this is what we can get, and they keep pushing these prices higher and higher. So the mandating is an issue, because if you can't get people to move, what can you do? You know, if you can't get them to agree. And so they've moved to more of an incentive type issue, and they're trying to give tax incentives to whatever these people put into the ground. So there are property tax exemptions proposed for gathering lines right now. There are exemptions for whatever they need to use to put that equipment there. And we'll see what comes out. I think we'll see a good incentive come out of this. There's actually very good bipartisan support. Some of the likely senators who would oppose this have been working very closely with industry to try to come up with a better policy to push it forward. And so we'll see where that goes. One piece of well, not an anecdote, a story. Well, I guess it's the same thing. I was sitting in the first hearing for the first flaring incentive bill this session, because it was right before another hearing I had to listen to in the same room. And the beauty of the legislative process is that anyone can be part of it at any time. So there was a gentleman in there for two bills after me, and he was listening to this tax exemption bill, and he just got so mad. He got up to the podium to testify, and he said, I don't know why you want to give all these breaks to all these big companies. I was just reading, and you can get a box the size of a can of Coke, and it just fuels your whole house. I mean, I read about it on the Google, he said, so it's true, and you should go check it out. So we see that all the time. It's not overly helpful when we're trying to move forward with good policy, but it is good for citizens to have that venue to do that and be part of the process. Okay, so another issue has been the pipeline safety and siting legislation that's come forward this session. We just passed, and it's actually been signed by the governor already, a bill that raises the fines for any sort of pipeline safety infraction. And so that is a good thing. Industry supported it. There was no opposition as far as I remember from any of the hearings. But we really are trying as an industry to protect the environment and protect people who come into contact with the pipelines. And so it's good that everyone supported raising the fines. We don't like people who don't follow the good safety regulations that we have put forward in the state. Another issue is pipeline siting. Again, we were talking about landowner fatigue. There are a lot of pipelines being laid in this state, And sometimes they have to vary their routes. The legislation that came in this time said, okay, so you have this easement with a landowner. Well, the legislation didn't say that. This is the story around it. You've got an agreement with a landowner, and all of a sudden they decide that in their grand plan they want to put a garden where you have this route. And so you want to foster good relationships with the people in the area for your other easements. So you say, okay, fine, let's figure out a better route. And so this bill that went in basically said if you have permission from the landowner and there are no other sort of health regulatory concerns, you may move that route on sort of a fast track through the PSC, basically alerting them, telling them here's where it is, this is all the work we've done, this is how it varies, and the PSC can look at it. If they have a problem, they call you into a hearing. If they don't, they can say, okay, that's fine. It's within our original corridor, so to speak, and you've made people happy, move it along. So that's a nice piece of common sense business legislation, I think. Transmission development, eminent domain. Again, citing landowner fatigue, a group came in and asked for a change in the law. I don't know where it's going to go. I heard that the hearing fell apart pretty rapidly yesterday, but here's what the bill does. It says that if you have something in front of the PSC and to cite that route, you can start eminent domain to get the land lined up for that route even before the PSC permits it. So maybe the PSC is considering 2 or 3 different routes. You can start all your eminent domain procedures on whichever route you want to do in the case that the PSC okays it. It's an interesting piece of legislation. We've been pretty silent on it. There are good things and bad things. And if you start the procedure and they don't permit it, you stop and you're out the money for starting that process, but you've already made a lot of landowners really upset. So I don't know. What I do know is that this sort of legislation has been passed in other states, and a couple of years later, they've come back. The pendulum has swung the other direction, and it's almost impossible to cite any sort of new transmission. So I don't know where they're going to go with this. And that's okay. But it's because of all the growth in the West, we need more transmission lines out there to provide more electricity. And so we've got to get lines out there. And so they feel like they're in a hurry, and yet there's a reason we have these processes in place. So we'll see what the legislators do. I heard it was a doozy of a hearing yesterday, though. Okay, oil production and extraction tax policy. There were a lot of bills presented dealing with a lot of the tax issues with oil and gas, and the overall policy I touched on before, and it's how high do we tax a resource that we know we only have so much of, and it's also that there is a really great political spin going on in this state right now about giving back tax money to people rather than just cutting the rates and not making them pay it in, and it's a Democrat-Republican type thing. If you cut taxes, are you giving it to the companies? Why aren't you giving it to other people who could use it more? And so we'll see how that rhetoric plays out. If you want my opinion, you can ask me about it later in the question section. Infrastructure development, again, we put, I don't know what the governor's bill put, $700 and some million into roads above and beyond all the other DOT road money. So that's being put out there. I think that they're also adding different things into the distribution, the tax distribution. So before, the money that came into the state for oil went out to counties, cities, townships, and school districts. And now they're looking at adding emergency services, social services, and things like that into the overall funding structure. So that's part of the overall infrastructure development, if you will. Impact mitigation. I'm trying to think where the bills are on that. I don't know. But there are a few bills that are being proposed to basically mitigate the impact of oil and gas development. And what I mean by that is that there were bills that had setback provisions. They were trying to expand on some remediation issues that are below in my consumer environmental and consumer issue. But I don't know that they're gaining a lot of ground on a lot of those issues right now. A lot of times bills are introduced by people who have one or two really angry constituents. They introduce the bill, other people hear about it, and they don't gain support like they thought throughout the rest of the people in the state. They find out that it's a really insulated issue. And so while it seems like a good idea to introduce, and them killing it might make them seem insensitive to some of these issues, it's because what they realize is the problem isn't that big. And I have not heard the problem escalate too much in the setback issues. Environmental concerns, again, the setbacks, we've got the remediation, which I think Mr. Cole was talking about way back, but we've always had remediation legislation for for coal and some for oil, and I think people right now are, again, using the legislature as kind of a sounding block for perceived damages years and years down the line that haven't happened yet. And so the legislature is trying to figure out what to do with that. Coal combustibles, the bill that is being considered basically says that coal combustibles are not a hazardous waste, and that we're fine with using them in whatever product. However, I believe an amendment was introduced yesterday to say that the federal government has primacy on this issue, so that if they come down and say it, it won't throw off all of our programs. And that was industry working together with the health department to introduce that. And then we do have a couple off-the-wall bills that are introduced every session. This year it was thorium. Who knows what thorium is? Yeah, I'm right there with you. Well, I was. It's involved with nuclear development, and so basically you take nuclear waste and you run this facility, and it's supposed to clean it up and use it in some other way. It came in as a favor to a grandson who was a constituent of a legislator, a very odd way to get in, and it was killed pretty quickly. However, what I've heard is the proponent is still pretty proud of that idea, and so he's going to keep doing some research, and we'll see if thorium comes back. Okay, so those are the issues that are on the table this session. Let me talk a little bit about our energy policy, where I think we're going from here, and then I'll take questions on any specifics, because I know I breezed through that. Okay, so back to our energy policy. In 2010, we codified, or 2011, we codified our state comprehensive energy plan that was drafted for the years 2010 through 2025. This was from the Empower Commission. It set out 20 energy goals. If anyone has questions on them, I have them here with me, and the report can be found on the Department of Commerce website if you're interested at all. If you just Google Empower or Bing, I don't know, I'm talking like the guy in the committee. If you look up Empower ND on your computer, you'll find a link to their comprehensive energy policy. But they said basically 3 overall goals for energy development, and then they broke it down by industry and concern. And this has been a guide to help legislators moving forward since 2011. What happened is they codified this policy, and in 2011, the commission came in with a lot of bills that they thought would help achieve this, and the legislature is always cognizant of the balance of power between them and anyone else, and so they made some tweaks, and we've changed the way Empower moves forward since then. Now, Empower creates a biennial report. They analyze all these issues and work with industry for the interim, and they come back, present it to the legislature, and the legislature decides if they want to move those issues forward. And then there's not a power issue, and everyone's happy. So let me talk a little bit about the commission. It's actually comprised of a variety of industry people and state people. We've got refining, agriculture, petroleum marketers, oil and gas, biodiesel, generation transmission, cooperatives, investor-owned utilities, wind, ethanol, lignite, more transmission, biomass, and the Department of Commerce. And then we'll also take however many ex officio members across the industry that want to be there. So you can see when I say industry, I'm not just talking fossil fuel industry. This is a large group that looks at energy issues across the spectrum. And in doing that, they're really able to flesh out the issues that help put forward a better energy industry in North Dakota. And there's not a lot of disagreement when you get down to these issues. Coal, for instance, would be supportive of biomass coming in. Ethanol doesn't have a problem with oil. They work together to try to figure out how we can move forward, because the reality of it is we have a lot of our generation coming from fossil fuels. They're not going away anytime soon, but eventually they'll dry up, and we need to figure out the roadmap for the future so they work together to do that. And that is what our policy does. Now, this session, in the report, they came together and they looked at 4 future goals. Infrastructure, research and development, workforce, and the regulatory environment. And the laws that they suggested to the legislature stemmed from these issues. And so you see that going forward, we're going to have industry looking at what are the issues, what can we do to help and urge that along. And so here's my Pollyanna type of summary about where I think we're going. I think we're in a good position at this point to address our future energy policy because we finally have everyone working together and we have a way to get these ideas accepted by the legislature. If Empower continues to provide these sorts of critical analysis of the issues, I think the legislature should be able to focus on that, come up with some common sense resolutions, and continue to foster our state energy goals. And I think that our energy base will continue to diversify. The companies that I work specifically, I work with utility companies, and all of them have a diverse base of fuels they use to create their energy. So we don't have an us against them type of mentality coming out from fossil fuels against renewables or renewables against fossil fuels. So I really think that we're in a good position moving forward to foster that. The way that the industry looks at that is considering all of the issues that I introduced at the beginning of my slide. And so hopefully, if this boom continues or if we have the next big thing that comes up, industry has already figured out what that's going to be. They know the concerns of making sure that the state can run successfully with that, and they're going to promote these ideas within the legislature. So that is my Pollyanna vision. However, saying that, I've listened to some of the presentations yesterday and today. I had to run out yesterday because I had a bill explode that should have been a no-brainer, but I got it passed this morning, so I'm good now. But I've been thinking about the talk about, do you legislate, do you litigate? Maybe there are some tweaks we'd want to make here. And this is what I will tell you. Even though I think we have the framework in place, we have the good policy moving forward, anytime you open up a can of worms in front of that legislature, you never know what's going to come out. So you really have to weigh that. Do I want to open this door? Do I want to work within the framework I have? And so who knows? Who knows going forward? But I'm going to stop talking, and I'm going to answer any questions at this time. I bored you all. Yes. Usually there's a gavel in a hearing, and they, stop me much earlier than you all did. The question was, what's going to happen with the oil tax bill? I think something's going to pass, quite honestly. I think that right now our effective tax rate is not too far from what the rate is that they're expecting or that they've proposed. I think that the tax itself is pretty convoluted with triggers and exemptions and incentives, and I think that what should happen is they should clean up all of that, make it pretty clear-cut, simple, and lower the rate to ensure that when business looks to see where they want to drill, they don't decide they just want to go somewhere else. We've got these leases held right now. They don't need to drill. They don't need to keep drilling on a lot of areas. They could pull their business and go somewhere else. So I think some sort of relief will pass. I don't know where it will be.
Now, if the legislature is talking about reducing the extraction or production taxes for oil companies, would that not be in violation of the agreement between the state and the 3 affiliated tribes?
Oh, that's a great question. I have not looked at that agreement for a couple of years.
Section D1 and D2 talk about the rate having to be 11.5%.
For the tribal amount to stay with the 80-20 and the 50-50?
Well, it talks about 11.5%, and then there's the revenue sharing agreement, which is 50-50 on trust lands and 80-20 on state lands. So I guess another question, is the state open to renegotiating that with the 3 affiliated tribes and also to come up with a more equitable agreement?
Well, that is a great question. The tribes have tried to renegotiate that pretty much from the year after it was enacted on, because we saw how the development took off. And I think that the legislature has not been overly open to that since then. And the ideas that I have heard is that were it not for that compact, they don't think this sort of development would have happened on tribal lands. And so they don't think the tribal compact has hurt. They think that it has helped. But as far as the equitable division, I mean, that's 80-20. It's hard to say, is that right or not? I have not heard the issues about the tribal compact come up when talking about this gas tax. Quite honestly, there are not a lot of people in that legislature who are all that savvy about that compact, because it wasn't negotiated with legislators. It was the governor and other groups. You bring up a good point. I don't know if we'll have an answer, actually, by the time it passes, unless we start hearing something about it. My prediction might be that they pass something without considering it, and then we end up with a whole nother can of worms. That happens. Other questions?
Are there any additional tax proposals, such as Senate Bill 2156, dealing with personal and corporate income tax rates, you imagine will be enacted? And what practical impact will that have on the energy sector here?
I imagine that we will see tax relief this session on property tax, corporate income tax, personal income tax. There will be a package that will come out. Whether it's on 2156 or another vehicle, I don't know. There are so many ideas being thrown out, and they often kill a lot of the bills and then roll those ideas back into some other package. We're a long ways away from knowing what that package is going to be, because we're just over the halfway point, and this is a big issue. But there will be reform, and I think that there will be significant reform for everyone across the board in that way. As far as its impact on the energy industry, lower taxes can do nothing but help industry, in my opinion. If you're paying less to the state for taxes, you have more money to put back into your own company or your employees or the community. So that would help. As far as the relief that then they're able to offer for oil and gas tax relief, I don't know that really plays into it, because the proposal that they're proposing right now, I think, keeps it pretty neutral. If you get rid of all the political spin and you actually look at the dollars and cents, I don't know that a corporate income tax reduction right now would stop a reduction in oil and gas taxes. I think that they could both coincide together at a pretty healthy level, if that answers your question. Do I sound evasive? I have been hanging around politicians a lot lately. Anything else?
I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Has there been any agency action, testimony, or proposed amendments which indicate an executive preference at odds with legislative action or any energy legislation?
That's an interesting question, and off the top of my head, I have to say no. And the reason I'm going to say that, is one, I haven't seen it, but we really have an executive structure that works to try to figure out the heart of these issues with industry, with the people involved, before they put the ideas forward. So I think to have an executive agency be at odds with a recommendation at this point would mean that they're going rogue, that they've broken some sort of agreement on what they think is the best thing moving forward, or maybe you have an employee from an agency who maybe doesn't see eye to eye and wasn't kept in check, so to speak, or a misunderstanding. Occasionally misunderstandings do occur. But I will tell you, because of our policy, our energy policy, the state agencies have been part of this, and during the interim process, we really see where everyone's coming from as far as these ideas. It would be shocking for industry even to put forth legislation that they know they're going to have strong opposition on. We really all try to work together to figure out what we can gain consensus on, what will work, and then we push it forward. And to give you an example on that, there was an issue earlier this session I can't tell you what the issue is because it's still kind of secret according to one of the companies I work with. But we were at odds with one of the other energy groups, and we talked briefly with leadership in one of the chambers, and they weren't on board. And knowing that we were at odds with leadership, we were at odds with other people in our industry, we didn't put it forward. And so I think when you put stuff forward, you try to make sure that you've got as much consensus as possible before opening up that can.
Hi, I have a question. Have there been any specific legislative proposals that have been killed, but you think will be reincorporated into a final bill?
That does happen from time to time. I can't think of a lot of energy-based things that have been killed that I see coming back. I do see things that maybe have been killed that will come back in conference committee to try to, throw out as a bargaining chip and muddy the waters. There are a lot of strategic games that are played up there, and so you might throw something back out there. If you have the support of your chamber, you might throw it back out there to see if you can bully the other side into it, or you might pretend it's important enough to you that the other side backs down on something else. So I don't know of any substantive stuff right now that I think will move forward, but you never know what's going to come up in the game playing, and I mean that respectfully.
Are there any hands we didn't see that wanted to ask a question?
I'd love to ask a question. It involves ethanol.
Okay.
Ethanol has been proven to be very destructive in all the little types of engines we have all around, including our watercraft, our lawnmowers at home, our own automobiles. And yet, for some reason, someone thinks it's a bright idea to create ethanol, force the food chain price up, double, triple, and just cause destruction amongst our neighborhood, ourselves. And why don't we kill this? Whose pocket are we feeding? Thank you, sir.
It's a great question, and I should say I don't represent any group that has ethanol development, so I can't speak on their behalf. What I can say is your feeling is not rare. However, in trying to look at all of our energy possibilities, we keep them in the loop to see where they might go. And let me say this. It's not all bad to have some sort of research in an area that turns out not to be the greatest thing, because then you're forced to look at how you can use it in another way. The Empower Commission, as I spoke about earlier, they have hearings and meetings all across the state and consider all the different facets of our energy development and our policy. And last year we had a meeting at NDSU at one of their business incubators, and this was a biomass group who couldn't use what they had to provide great energy. However, they figured out in that process how to make incredible plastics that are stronger, cheaper, don't use any sort of petroleum-based product, and they're using waste product after whatever ag product has been used. And so perhaps ethanol might be at a crossroads at some point where they have to decide, do they want to keep going with that, or do they want to look at a different way to use those sorts of technologies? I know the cost is...
The petroleum industry told us back when in the 60s, gas is just a byproduct. We don't pay any attention to gasoline. For cars, it's just, we just have to get rid of it. And, it was 14 cents a gallon when I came back from Turkey and got out of the Air Force. And plastics is where we make our money.
Sure.
And we don't pour money into petroleum companies in taxes out of our pocket, but yet ethanol gets our pocketbook? No. I mean, it's totally upside down. We just need to kill ethanol and be done with it.
I would tell you that if I agree with you when I'm not on camera in front of everyone else, but I hear you clucking.
I'll just make a side comment on ethanol too. The BTUs that you use to get ethanol are greater than the BTUs that ethanol provides. So that's another absolute argument against ethanol. But could we talk about solar and wind? We know that North Dakota is rich in wind. I see a lot of wind in South Dakota, and I see a lot of it out in the desert in Palm Springs. But I guess I'm not aware of how much is going on in North Dakota with wind. And is there any, is North Dakota, I'm ignorant as to how much sun there is in North Dakota. I'm thinking there's not a whole lot.
Good questions. I reached over because I have this book that the Great Plains Energy Corridor puts out every, so often, outlining all of our energy resources. I grabbed this up at the BSC Energy Center, and it has it's called Spotlight on North Dakota Energy. According to them, we have, I don't know, not a ton of solar energy, but it's part of this makeup. I'll give you this before you leave because I have other copies, but wind is larger. We do have some significant wind farms. We have companies that are diversifying into wind because of the 25 by 25 mandate. The problem with, there are problems with wind over, fossil fuels as far as energy generation. Sometimes I shouldn't go too much into specific utility stuff, but I know that there was an outage last year caused by something weird that happened with one of the wind turbines that gummed up a system, and it was a minor thing, but it's just not reliable. When the wind blows, a lot of times is when you don't need the energy. Energy needs go up and down hour to hour throughout the day. And wind is viable, but we have to figure out a better way, I think, to use it. But that's my personal opinion. My companies all use wind, so I'm not trying to criticize it by any means. But we're trying to capture it. We're expanding. There is, if you're really supportive of wind, there is a sales tax exemption for wind production bill that will be heard on Monday at 9 to continue on an exemption that's already in place, and it barely snuck through the House. Now it's in the Senate. So by all means, tell your senators you support wind. But I don't know if wind's going to expand. David, what do you have to say about that? Oh, he's maybe not going to say anything. Okay.
Feel his pain.
Okay. Again, cool. I love it.
30 years ago, studies were made about wind generation, and the current technology 30 years ago really put wind at a never payoff position. And here we are again, taking money out of our own pocketbooks, tax supported, to do wind, just like alcohol. And it is a maintenance hog. But it employs a minority in our country because the president mandated it. It's still taking our tax dollars. And it is horrible to support compared to petroleum. I mean, come on. If it was better because it netted out easy in our pocketbook, great. But when did we ever pour our tax dollars into the petroleum industry? It's crazy.
I appreciate your comments because this is really indicative of the discussions we have up at the Capitol. You have constituents who have strong feelings on one side or the other, and out of that we need to create good policy. And so I appreciate that. Again, I can't comment on the record about it.
Does anyone else have any questions for Ms. McLeod?
Perhaps we could move to the bar and have continued discussions about some of these issues. All right, well, thank you so much.